Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Rethinking Supply Chain Strategy in Complex Markets. My name is Tara Faulkner and I'm the Director of Communications for MIT's Center for Transportation and Logistics. Throughout the presentation today, you will have the opportunity to type in questions as you think of them. Please use the Q&A function in WebEx as opposed to the chat function, so we will be able to see your questions as they come up. At the end of the presentation, those questions will be addressed by our featured speaker, whom I have the pleasure of introducing to you right now. Dr. Roberto Perez-Franco is a research associate here at CTL. He is the director of the Supply Chain 2020 project, the academic director of our Graduate Certificate in Supply Chain and Logistics program, and program manager of MIT Scale Latin America. He's been part of the Supply Chain 2020 project since 2006 and its director since 2012. Dr. Perez-Franco was also a member of the core research team for CTL's Future Freight Flows project and was directly involved in developing multiple future scenarios and facilitating work sessions to derive insights for the long-term planning of logistics infrastructure through scenario thinking. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Perez-Franco.
Thank you, Tara. I want to welcome all the participants that are joining us from around the world. It is my pleasure to be here today, and I will do my best to convey to you the essence of what we have been doing during the last 6 to 7 years of research in the Supply Chain 2020 project. But I want to start with a disclaimer. The kind of research we do is what is called collaborative management research. And I don't come to you as a guru. I'm not going to preach to you. I'm not going to tell you how things are. All the opposite. I come to you with a lot of humbleness. We learn from managers and from what we call practitioners, that is people that are in the industry. We learn as much from you as you learn from us. So I think we see each other like in this cartoon, like a solution to each other's problem. But the truth is, academics don't have all the answers, and I don't come to you pretending that I do. So. Let me start with a brief outline of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to give you a little bit about the theory of complexity and complex problems, just whatever we need to then understand how our approach that we have developed here at MIT's Supply Chain 2020 project will then help us tackle these complexity challenges. So I talk about complexity first in abstract, then I tell you about our approach, and then I will wrap up by combining how our approach addresses these complexity issues. So let's start with a bit of theory on complex problems. What I'm showing you here is a position, a chess position. It is a part of the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, one of the sharpest openings in chess. And it is widely regarded as, if not the most complex, one of the most complex openings that anybody can play, and that's why probably the world champion former world champion Garry Kasparov used it so much, because what makes it complicated is that it can then evolve into many very varied systems of openings. So from this position, it can go into a very sharp game, or it can go into a very positional game, and that makes it very complex. So this is an example of what is called objective complexity. You can think of it also as absolute complexity, something that is complex because it is. The number of elements that the system includes, the possible states that these elements can take, the number of relationships that exist between these elements, all these things make this system complex. And this is going to be complex for anybody that considers this position. Now, obviously, depending on who you are, for you, that complexity may feel different. If you are a computer, like, for example, I have a chess playing software that is called Houdini, which is fantastic, and when I play it in my computer, not even the world champion could beat this simple desktop PC. But a world champion in chess is not going to consider the Najdorf as complex as I would, for example. I would struggle for months and months trying to make sense of it. So there is what we call the subjective complexity. And then the subjective complexity, or relative complexity, is determined by how complex the system is to begin with. That is to say, the objective complexity of the system, but also your own capacity or ability to understand that system. And also by the time pressure that is exerted upon you to make a decision. Even the best chess player, if they only have seconds left in the clock, may make a mistake. So try to translate this into your managerial position in a supply chain of a company. Your supply chain may have its own objective complexity, where you have a number of product lines, you have a number of SKUs, a number of customers, a number of suppliers, and that makes your supply chain complex. But also, the subjective complexity of your supply chain will depend on who you are. If you have a good understanding of your supply chain and you have the tools to make this analysis, then it's going to be less complex from the subjective point of view. Also, the time pressure that you have. If you have one day to make an important decision on your supply chain versus if you have a month or a year to make that decision, that's going to affect your level of subjective complexity. Besides this difference between objective and subjective complexity, I also want to present to you the difference between well-defined problems and not so well-defined problems. Well-defined problems are usually characterized by these features. They will have a desired end state or a desired goal that is well known, is exactly known, and you also know what criteria you're going to use to measure that desired state. The field of reality in which the problem exists is known precisely to you. Now, if you see, this is, for example, the case of a chess problem. You know the criteria, you know the goal, you want to give checkmate, and you know the field of realities, the board and your pieces. But this also applies to many mathematical problems, and many other problems that are usually tackled through, are simplified to be tackled through simulation. And what people do, decision makers do, is that to keep problems easily accessible to formal treatments, including computer simulation and others, what they do is that they limit these problems to static objects. That means they ignore the dynamic aspect of the problem, or try to minimize the dynamic aspect. They limit their analysis to objects that are not very complex, and they limit their analysis to objects that are completely transparent, meaning that you can know all the characteristics of this object, and also you can conceive of all the shapes in which this object may come or that it may shape into. Now, think about the problems you face in your supply chain management role. Are these supply chain problems well defined? Do you always know the desired state of your supply chain? Do you always know the field, the market in the industry to all the level of precision you would like? Is it a static object? Is it not very complex? Is it totally transparent and evident and easily conceivable, all the states it can take? Obviously, no. So that's the case of what we call the other type of problems, or the not so well-defined problems, which, to give it a shorter name, we could call complex problems. And these problems have a tendency to be very common in daily life. And the case is with these problems that they frequently have goals that are vague, and that results in the fact that it is not always clear what the aspired state is. You are not certain of what the aspired goal is that you're shooting for. Saying things like, we want to work with the minimal inventory possible, or we want to maximize customer service. Yeah, so it's a goal, but how clear is it? How well defined is it? It's more like you can, something comes to your mind when you hear that, but it's not totally clear what it means. Also, in the not well-defined problems or complex problems, you have conflicts between partial goals, because there are contradictory relationships between things like, for example, customer service or inventory level, or efficiency, flexibility, things like that, the classic trade-offs of supply chain theory. Also, complex problems are characterized by a lack of knowledge of the possible operators. Operators are the things you can change, so you're not sure of all the things that you could modify, or to what extent you could modify them. And also, you're not certain about all the possible states this system might take, meaning all the results that can come from your changing the variables. If you make a change, something that you didn't expect could happen, what we call an emergent property or an unexpected consequence. And also, a fourth characteristic of complex problems is that it is often necessary to act with incomplete or inexact or even incorrect information. And you may be aware that you don't have the whole information, or that you have information that is only partially right, but guess what? You still have to go ahead and make the decision. So this is more of the reality of decision making with complex problems. Now, after this nutshell overview of complexity and problem solving, what can we do in terms of complexity in our supply chain? We cannot eliminate complexity completely, but we can, like a lion, we can learn to tame it. And the things that you can do based directly on the theory that I just gave you, and this is based on the work of Professor Dorner from back in 1983, but it's true today as it was back then. Well, you can reduce the objective complexity of the system. That's one thing you can do, the intrinsic absolute complexity of the system. But also you can increase your ability to understand the system. And you can reduce the time pressure in decision making. If you had more time, it would be less complex for you. If you were more able to analyze the system, it would be easier for you. If the system was less complex in itself, it would be easier for you. This is what we call reducing the subjective complexity, because remember that the subjective complexity depends on objective complexity, your ability, and the time pressure you have. But there's something else we can do. We can also have a very clearly defined specification of the desired end state. We can also keep an eye on all the conflicts that exist between partial goals. And we can increase our knowledge about the structure of the system. And we can get more complete information. And this is what we call define the problem better. Basically trying to move the problem from a not so well-defined type of problem closer to a well-defined type of problem. It will never be a well-defined type of problem because it's not a chess position, but the more, this is a spectrum, the closer you can get to the well-defined end, the easier it will be for you to do this. And it is our contention that by doing all these prescriptions, you will be able to take your very complex supply chain and tame the complexity in it. So now I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to move away from the theory of complexity and problem solving, and I'm going to tell you about the work that we have been doing during the last 7 years. We have derived a series of steps that we recommend supply chain managers do when they need to rethink their supply chain strategy. And we also have derived a working model of supply chain strategy for the purposes of rethinking it. And this has nothing to do with the complexity theory that I just told you, but at the end, I will tie it together, and I will tell you how our method will help you with those 7 prescriptions that I just showed you to tame complexity. So the outline of our approach to supply chain strategy starts with the question of how should we think about supply chain strategy, because before we can rethink the supply chain strategy, we need to be able to think about it in the first place. So, and supply chain strategy is an abstract concept, and as such, we could spend days discussing what it means, but I'm not interested in that. We're only interested in the definition to the extent that it allows us to have a good conversation about it and the challenges it presents. So, through collaborative management research, we have developed a pragmatic view of supply chain strategy, and that's what I want to tell you right now. We see, pragmatically, we see supply chain strategy as the logical bridge that connects my business strategy and my operational practices. So that thing that is in between my business strategy and my operational practices is my supply chain strategy. Now, funny thing here is that any company that has a supply chain has, by definition, operational practices in the supply chain. Maybe they are not documented, maybe they are not well design, but people are doing things in that supply chain. So those are the operational practices of the supply chain. And in most cases, firms have at least a nominal business strategy. Now, what they don't have in most cases is a well-defined, well-articulated, explicit supply chain strategy. But we invite you to think about supply chain strategy as that link that is going to help you connect your business strategy with your practices. Now, let's add more granularity to this approach. Let's begin with the business strategy. You have heard things like a vision, mission, or purpose of the firm. Usually firms have this thing like a short and sweet one statement that condenses what they want to be or do. That's what we call the core strategy. And usually firms also have a set of 3 to 5 high-level, general, relatively vague strategic objectives that we call pillars, and these elaborate a little more on the core. So this you usually have. Now, something that you don't have very often is an articulated supply chain strategy. But let me tell you what in our model, what it would look like. You would start by having a further specification of what the pillars mean for a series of areas of interest. I will have more to say about imperatives in a minute, but basically they are specific statements of purpose that define the success of the supply chain in terms of the strategy. Then you would have a collection of principles, of rules of thumb that will guide the supply chain in the decision-making process. And finally, you would have a collection of specific policies that would be applied to different instances in the supply chain. And then what emerges here is sort of a cascading pyramid. I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to present you with my definition of supply chain strategy. It's a working definition. The supply chain strategy would be the collection of supply chain relevant, and put a pin on that, we're going to come to supply chain relevant imperatives, principles, and policies that serve as the logical bridge between the business strategy and the operational practices of a business unit supply chain, or it could be an organization supply chain. Now, what is this thing about supply chain relevant? Supply chain relevant means that even if it is not hierarchically part of the supply chain function, it still affects the supply chain. For example, some companies may have the purchasing function or the sales function outside of the jurisdiction of the supply chain head, but these are activities that clearly affect the supply chain strategy. So the supply chain. So that's why they are supply chain relevant. Remember, I mentioned this cascade of concepts. So these elements that I'm showing here, the core, the pillars, the imperatives, principles, policies, and practices, are what we call the conceptual elements, because they are basically a group of ideas or concepts that are within our control. And you can also see that they are spread in this kind of spectrum that I call the strategy operation continuum, where things that are closer to the top are more strategic in focus, and in the bottom more operational, more abstract near the top, more concrete near the bottom, wider in scope near the top, and narrower in scope near the bottom, more specific than that is to say. And near the top, they tend to be statements of purpose. Near the bottom, they tend to be statements of practice. But there's more, of course, to the supply chain strategy than just the business strategy and the operational practices. There's this whole context that we have to consider when we think in the supply chain strategy. Let's talk about that context. First, let's start with what we call the enabling elements. We have things like assets. Assets are the things you have to do work with. This can be physical, financial, even human. The other thing that is an enabling element is the culture. Culture is the way you do things. And then you have capabilities, which are the things you know how to do. So these three things together help make these concepts from the pyramid, the conceptual elements, help make them a reality. And since they are within our control, we can call these the internal elements of the model. Now, there are things also that are outside our control. For example, we may have guidelines from our parent organization. If we belong to a corporation, there may be guidelines from the corporation that are not within our control, but we have to follow. Also, we compete in a market, for example, or an industry, and there are regulations for the market. There are what the other competitors are doing, what my customers are demanding for, etc. And these are things that I can influence, but I cannot fully control. So these things are called local factors. And furthermore, there are things about the world that I can neither influence nor control. Things like the growth of population in Asia, or climate change, or a pandemic, or world hunger, or the increasing cost of energy. So these things still may affect my supply chain strategy, but they are way beyond my control and influence. Once you take this whole thing, external and internal factors, what emerges is what we call our working model for rethinking the supply chain strategy. Now, this gives you sort of a structure, but it doesn't give you a map. It doesn't give you a series of steps. So now I'm going to tell you about the fundamental tasks that we think are involved in rethinking a supply chain strategy. The first task is scoping, and it takes place along what we call the axis of complexity of a supply chain strategy. Things like, for example, your time horizon. Are you going to rethink your supply chain strategy for 2 years, for 5 years, for 10 years? Also, your geographical scope. Are you going to rethink it for North America? Are you going to rethink it for Asia Pacific? Are you going to rethink it for all your 5 regions, like Asia and the North and South America and Europe and Africa? What are you going to? So how much are you going to include? Your supplier types. Are you going to include only the strategic suppliers or also the suppliers of commodities? The customer types. Are you going to include your national accounts or your independent retailers or your different, there are different segments. Which ones are you going to include? Your product types. Are you going to include your, let's say in the case of Coca-Cola, are you going to include just the carbonated drinks? Are you going to include also the juices or the waters? That kind of thing. Your product categories. And then the channels. Are you going to include only like online sales or only retail sales, or only wholesale? And so when you take all these considerations, I mean, if you're a very complicated company and you try to go for all in each one of these axes, the result is going to be way too complex. So here the trick is about trying to balance realism and complexity. It needs to be rich enough in detail, so you want to include enough information, but you don't want to go wild because then it becomes unmanageable. And the recommendation here is to scope it in chunks that are interacting with each other and kind of segment it when there is not much interaction taking place. For example, if I have a canned food division and I have a frozen food division and there is little to no interaction between the two, I may split those in two and consider them as separate problems. That would be an example of scope. Another task that we have identified is the task that we call visioning. Visioning is important if you're rethinking for the long term. If you're rethinking for the short term, not so much. But usually, since strategic decisions have a long time horizon in impact, we tend to do rethinking for the mid to long term. So visioning is about considering what the local forces and what the driving forces and the local factors may look in an alternative vision of the future. And then once you have done that, think about another and yet another alternative to the future. Think about 3 or 4 different worlds and flesh them out in a lot of detail. And then try to think about the implications that these things would have for your supply chain. And here, our recommendation, which is not the subject of this webinar, but I want to mention it in a nutshell, is not to predict the future events, but instead to prepare for the effects that those events may have. A third task is specification. And this borrows a page from the book of engineering design, where if you're writing the specifications of a product, you would look at things like, okay, so how heavy should the product be? How should it be fireproof? Should it be children friendly? Should it be biodegradable? Should it be made of metal or plastic, things like that? So the specifications in a product is an idea that we can intuitively grasp, but when we talk about supply chain strategy, we don't tend to think about specification. Well, what I'm telling you is that based on your pillars and based on the guidelines of your parent organization, the local factors, meaning the features of your market and industry, and the global forces, you should be able to write a definition of success for your supply chain. I will know I have achieved it when I have hit all these 20 things. My inventory is like this and like that, and my customer services are like this and like that, and my geographical coverage of my market share is so much and so much. So you define success, but define it in a specific way that allows you to know when you have achieved that goal, but without prescribing a means. So that's the balancing act there. You don't want to go, you don't want to stay vague. You want to be specific enough to know when you have achieved it, but you don't want to go all the way to prescribing how you are going to achieve it. Tell me what you want to achieve, not how you want it done. That's what specification is about. Then a fourth task, which may sound a bit esoteric because we tend to take for granted that we know what we're doing, is articulation. Articulation refers to the task of expressing a supply chain strategy in explicit terms. Like I told you, in our practice, in our interactions with companies and also in conversations with people that interact with companies, we have come to this realization that most companies don't have a well-articulated supply chain strategy, and we think this is crucial. The recommendation that we have is to remember that cascading that cascading series of concepts that I showed you, the pyramid. So what we recommend is that you try to do that kind of map in what is called a conceptual map. You start from the top and map on the top with the nominal concepts, the concepts that you hope to achieve, and near the bottom you map the ones based on your activities, the things that you are doing. This is what we call a functional strategy map, and it's an explicit articulation of that logical bridge between the core strategy and the operational practices. Now, you can articulate not only your current supply chain strategy, you can also articulate your competitors if you know it, or you can articulate an alternative to your current supply chain strategy. So this is a very handy tool, but most people don't think about it. And it takes some time to do it well, but it's very beneficial once you have completed it. Another task is evaluation. And evaluation is about assessing to what extent a given supply chain strategy, say your current supply chain strategy or one that you are considering, would work towards achieving a desired set of objectives, which in this case are the imperatives. Now, obviously, articulation and specification are prerequisites for evaluation, because if you have not articulated what you have, then you cannot go and evaluate it. Same way, if you have not articulated what success looks like in the list of imperatives, then you cannot go on and evaluate whether you're achieving success. So you need to know what you have, and you need to know what success looks like before you can go into evaluation. But once you have those, then you will need a series of criteria to conduct this evaluation. We have identified a series of evaluation criteria. 3 of them are what we call hard criteria or must-have criteria. The first one and most obvious one is support. Every supply chain concept should be supporting one of the concepts that is above it, one of the concepts that is considered a goal. So, for example, if I have a policy in place, that policy better be serving one of my imperatives. The other criteria is compatibility, and where any of my supply chain concepts is expected to be compatible with any other concept within its same layer, its same level in the pyramid. And the idea here of compatibility, I'm not talking about harmony or getting along together. Compatibility means that they can coexist, that you can have A and B at the same time. And then feasibility means that, and this is more important when you're rethinking, when you're making a new supply chain strategy, feasibility means that anything that you propose, let's say as an imperative, as a goal, it has to be feasible. It has to be something that you can realize through actions that you can take at lower levels of abstraction. Besides these hard evaluation criteria, we also have a set of software evaluation criteria. We have what we call the good-to-have evaluation criteria. We have, for example, coverage. That means that you should make a decision in any area of interest that matters to you. If innovation is important for you, then you have to take a stance regarding innovation, even if that stance is, I'm not going to pay attention to it. But you have to confess what is your position regarding that area of interest, be it collaboration, be it innovation, be it environmental impact. So you have to, if you don't, then you have a coverage problem, you have a blind spot. Another evaluation criteria that is good to have is that of sufficiency. And that sufficiency speaks to the fact that even if my supply chain concepts are supporting the goals above them, I have to make sure that the goals are getting enough support to the point of being sufficiently satisfied by the collective effort that they receive from the concepts below it. An example that I like to give about the difference between sufficiency and support is that if I eat a salad for lunch, that's supporting my goal of eating healthy, but it's not sufficient, because then I go and have 2 chocolate bars. So that's the difference between support and sufficiency. Then we go to the nice-to-have evaluation criteria. One is a term that may be familiar to you, is the term of synergy, and here is the idea that it is desirable for a concept to have a mutually beneficial relationship with other concepts within its own level. But also, let me flip that concept of synergy and tell you, if I call that positive synergy, you want to have that, but also you want to avoid the opposite. You want to avoid the negative synergy. I'm still looking for a word for that. I may have to make one up. But the idea is that you want to avoid relationships that are mutually detrimental. And this is what in supply chain and many other areas we call trade-offs. You want to minimize the impact of trade-offs, the negative impact of trade-offs. And then the last nice-to-have evaluation criteria is parsimony. Parsimony just means that if you want to achieve a goal and you can achieve that goal through 2 means, you should take the one that will use less resources. Now, I'm not advocating for all supply chain strategies to be driven by efficiency. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that if you want to achieve one objective and you can get it done to the same satisfaction by means A or means B, go for the one that requires less resources. That's a kind of an economy of effort kind of thing. Okay, so that's about evaluation. Now, once we have articulated what we have in place and evaluated whether it's working or not, then we go to the process of rethinking it and trying to come up with something new, something better, changing only the areas that need to be changed. And then here we do two things that collectively, I call tasks 6 and 7, I call them supply chain formulation, but I have also individual names for each one of those. Task 6 is about concept generation. Concept generation means I give you a chance to think new ideas about, for example, say, innovation. Take innovation, worry only about innovation, don't worry about other things, don't worry about cost management, don't worry about customer service. Just think about innovation. Tell me things you would do to satisfy our objectives in innovation. And then you tell me those things, and I write them down, and I put it in what I call a bucket for that area of innovation. And I do that for all the areas of interest that matter to me. Once I have done that, once I have generated all the concepts, then I move to task number 7, which is the system assembly. System assembly means that I'm going to use what is called a heurism, and I'll define heurism in a moment. I will apply heurism to formulate a new and improved supply chain strategy by assembling these concepts little by little progressively. Because I assemble these concepts progressively as a system, this method is called the progressive conceptual system assembly. Now, I mentioned the word heurism. A heurism is, just like an algorithm is a sequence of steps, a heurism is a sequence of steps to solve a problem. The difference is that there is no guarantee that you're going to find a solution or that the solution exists or that the solution you're getting is optimal. So a heurism is to a complex problem what an algorithm would be to a well-defined problem, broadly speaking. So here is an example of a PCSA, or a progressive conceptual system assembly, that is taking place. As you see, we have different areas of interest, and we are putting together different concepts. I start in the top left, and I make a decision regarding service. Then I move to my right to the second area, and I make a decision about cost. Then I move to the right again, and I make a decision about assets. Once I have completed the first line, then I go again and to the first area and make a decision again there. The PCSA is more complicated than I can explain in this webinar, but it's at the core of our reformulation process, and we will be documenting it in full detail in a book that we're writing about supply chain strategy. It should be completed by the mid or end of next year. But for the purposes of this webinar, that should be enough information. Then we go into the task of implementation. Now, what implementation is about is, the task of implementation is about adapting the enabling elements or the inertial elements, namely the assets or the culture or the capabilities, adapting those to the new conceptual elements, to the new supply chain strategy. Put in simple terms, if I have come up with a new supply chain strategy, then now I have to make sure that my culture is adapted to the new supply chain strategy. I have to make sure that my assets are adapted to the new supply chain strategy. I have to make sure that my capabilities are adapted to the new supply chain strategy. And the problem here is that companies often do it the other way. They design supply chain strategies based on their culture, based on their assets, and based on the capability, which I'm not saying that you should not consider them, but what I'm saying is that you should not let these enabling elements to dictate your supply chain strategy, because these enabling elements should follow from your supply chain strategy. So once you adapt them, then you would have an implemented supply chain strategy. So what would it look if we were to sequence these 8 tasks that I have mentioned? There are different ways in which you can do this sequence. I'm going to show you a vanilla baseline sequence that we would use to rethink the supply chain strategy of the business unit for the middle term. This means that I'm not going to show you anything regarding visioning, but this is if I wanted to do it for a business strategy, for a business unit in the midterm, this is what I would do. I would start by scoping the problem, define which products I want to include, which customers, which channels, etc. Then I would have part of my team articulate my current supply chain strategy so that I know where I am standing today. And I would have a separate sub-team that I call the strategic sub-team, crafting the specification of what I want to achieve. What is my desired state? Give me the list of imperatives that define success. Now, what is the reason I have two different groups of people doing these two different tasks? Well, it's easy to see. If I have the same people telling me what I have today and what I want to achieve and what my desired state is, the human temptation is going to be to try to fit what I have today to my desired state. I would rather have people thinking independently about what we have today without worrying about what it should be. And on the other hand, then, having in a separate room people thinking about what should be without worrying about what we have today. Once I know what I have today and what I'm shooting for, then I conduct the evaluation. And this gives me a diagnostic of where I'm standing today. If what I have today is good enough, then I keep the current supply chain strategy. If it is not good enough, then I go into the reformulation, which, as I told you, starts with concept generation, where I will ask for new ideas in all the different areas of interest. Tell me about innovation, what things we could be doing there. Tell me about procurement, how we could do procurement differently, and so on. And then once I have all these alternatives in buckets, then I take my PCSA heurism and I start assembling this new supply chain strategy as a system. I have mentioned that this supply chain strategy is designed as a system, but I have not defined system. This is the engineering systems division within MIT, so we take it for granted that everybody knows what a system is. But in this context, it means a system is a collection of elements that are working together towards a common goal. A conceptual system is the same thing. It's a group of concepts or ideas that are working together to achieve common goals. So when I say that I'm formulating my new supply chain strategy as a conceptual system, what I mean is that I'm putting together a group of supply chain concepts that are going to be pushing together towards the achievement of the imperatives. That's what I mean. Then I evaluate, is it good enough, the result? If it is not, then back to the drawing board. And if it is, then I go into implementation. And finally, a task that I didn't mention but goes without saying, because strategy is a continuous process, is monitoring. I basically keep an eye on how are things performing, etc. And that's why the end has an asterisk, because we are never done really with the strategizing, neither at the supply chain level nor at the business level. Now, as I had promised you, I started with telling you a little bit about the theory of complexity and complex problem solving. Then I went to tell you an outline of the methods that we have derived, the model and the methods that we have derived for supply chain strategy, a very kind of a bird's eye kind of thing. Now let me tie it back together to you, and let me make the case that some of the tasks that we have developed and some other aspects of our approach to supply chain strategy work along the lines of that prescription for taming complexity in the supply chain. First, the prescription of reducing the objective complexity of the system. If you may remember, objective complexity means the complexity that is inherent to the system, because it has a lot of elements, because it has a lot of relationship between the elements, has nothing to do with your ability to understand it. Now, what do we do about it? Well, remember scoping, when I told you about scoping, that you may you may decide to focus only on some of your customers or some of your products or some geographical regions or some time horizon or some channel or some supplier type or whatever. So that's what you do. Basically, you pick a part of the problem that is not too complicated for you to handle, but still retains enough richness to be meaningful as an exercise. That's something you can do to reduce the objective complexity of the system. Not the system as a whole, mind you, but the system that you're rethinking at that time, which will be a subset of your supply chain. Now, there are things that you can do also to reduce the complexity of your system as a whole, but they are not part of our method. Things like avoiding SKU proliferation or better segmenting your customers, and maybe, I don't know, that's more of a strategy decision, things like discontinuing service to less profitable customers and so on and so forth. That will reduce the complexity of your system, but it would depend on whether your business strategy calls for that. That's why it's not part of our method. What are things you can do also to reduce objective complexity? Another thing you can do, another prescription was to increase your knowledge about the structure of the system. Remember there was a prescription? So what are we doing in that regard? Well, to increase the knowledge about the structure of the system, we are giving you a working model that helps you understand the supply chain strategy structure and the structure of the context. We tell you, think about supply chain strategy as a bridge between business strategy and operational practices, and you have these imperatives, and you have these principles, and you have these policies, and then you have these enabling elements, and you have these parent guidelines and local factors and driving forces. This is all giving you a structure that you can then populate, and that's going to help you understand, increase the knowledge of the system. Of course, the content will change whether you are Coca-Cola or Walmart or Boeing, but the structure at that generic level is common. Another prescription to reduce complexity was to try to get more complete information. Well, our tasks of articulation and visioning go precisely to that question. Articulation and evaluation together help you get more complete information about what you have today. And visioning helps you get more information about what the future may bring. You're not predicting the future, but you're kind of vaccinating yourself against surprises. Now, another prescription was to reduce the time pressure in decision making. Now, there are things you may be able to do in that regard in terms of just like managerial style and stuff, but here I'm talking about avoiding surprises. If something surprises you, if something happens and you had not seen it coming, then you're going to be making decisions under time pressure. But think, for example, Royal Dutch Shell back in the 70s, when the oil crisis happened, they were fast to react. Why were they fast to react? Because they had seen it in part of their visioning exercises. They had these memories of the future. They had been vaccinated against this surprise. So in that sense, visioning helps you reduce time pressure because it will minimize the chance that you will be blindsided, and it also prepares you to react faster to change. Another prescription was to clearly specify the desired end state, and this is clearly achieved by the task that we call specification, where you have to define a thoroughly, a comprehensive set of clear goals of what success looks like. And this is, it sounds obvious, but let me tell you, most companies don't have this list of imperatives. The other thing is to pay attention to the conflicts between partial goals, and this is built into the PCSA heurism. Basically, the PCSA is built around promoting compatibility and synergy of the elements you add to the formulation. So this is taken care of basically by design. And the final prescription is to increase your ability to understand the system. I think here what I can say is that as a whole, taken as a whole, our supply chain 2020 approach to rethinking the supply chain strategy of a firm will help you have a better, be more able to understand the system and be more able to rethink your system. So in that sense, that's where we think complexity comes from, and that's how we think you can address this complexity. Now, I've tried my best to summarize in a nutshell the work of many years and to make it accessible. I hope I've been successful to some extent, and now I'm open to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. So we will take questions now. Just as a reminder to those participating, if you could use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat to submit your questions, that would be great. We have a few questions that have already come in, so we'll begin. Where do the evaluations you spoke of, the evaluation criteria, come from, and why do they seem to not be specific to supply chain?
Okay, so this is a very good question. The evaluation criteria that I mentioned doesn't seem to be, it is not, by the way, honestly, specific to supply chain. Things like support, compatibility, synergy, coverage, sufficiency, feasibility, or parsimony. There's nothing specific about supply chain in those criteria. I mean, you could be talking about just procurement, just marketing. You could be talking about project management. And so this is made like that, like kind of independent of any supply chain philosophy. It's made like that by design. The old school of supply chain strategy says that kind of commodity products should have an efficient supply chain, and innovative products should have a flexible supply chain. But reality is that supply chains are more complicated than that. Supply chains don't come in two flavors, and products don't come in two flavors. There is a whole spectrum. The first thing a company will tell you is, we are unique. We are unique. But our company is unique. This is the first thing they will tell you. Therefore, we try to keep our criteria general enough so that it will apply across the board. Now, it was kind of a surprise for us that when we came up with this criteria, it turns out it's also applicable in areas that are not directly under the supply chain domain, but that was kind of an added benefit. Now, to the question of where they come from, Part of them came from interviews with practitioners, part of them came from collaborative management research projects that we conducted, but also part of them come from the literature, specifically from two papers, one by Porter in 1996, where he talks about the 3 levels of fit, and another one by Rommel from 1979, where he talks about how to evaluate a business strategy. And we adapted those ideas to the supply chain strategy evaluation.
Okay, thank you. The next question is has to do with articulation. What has been your experience with articulation, and is it really necessary?
Articulation, thank you for the question. Articulation is a very expensive exercise in the sense that to do it well, it is like wine or whiskey. So you have to take the time to do the barrel and let it age and so on. So our articulation exercises take usually months. It may be 2 months, it may be 3 months, depending on the commitment of the company. And it includes interviews to 20 to 40 people. But the result is well worth it. Back in March, we had a roundtable on supply chain strategy, and one of the participants was the VP of supply chain strategy of a company that had worked with us. And he said, I remember, he was talking about the articulation step. He said, I remember when we did this with Roberto, because I was facilitating the exercise. And he said it was painful, it was very painful, but it was very, very useful. And actually, in his assessment, just getting the map, the functional strategy map that is the result of the articulation, was getting him half of the way to his desired state. For him, half of the solution was just articulating this. So I have to say the experience with articulation has been that it is not an inexpensive exercise, but it's a very, very valuable one and a good platform to build upon in subsequent steps.
Right. Thank you. The next question, can you talk about which people or teams should be involved in completing the 8 tasks that you outlined, and should there be, for example, a project team that oversees this effort?
That's an excellent question. So there has to be, let me start by saying, there has to be a project sponsor or champion. You need to have a person in a position of authority. Probably the ideal candidate is the VP of supply chain that is championing this thing and is asking his team members to participate. We have seen that the success of the projects is directly proportional to the involvement of this champion. If you don't have a VP of supply chain that is really believing into this thing, then the other guys are not going to follow. Now, regarding the composition of the people that will be involved in the different tasks, we talk about levels. We talk about level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is the lowest hierarchical level that is still involved in crafting the business strategy. For example, let's say that your business strategy is crafted by the VP of supply chain and the VP of marketing and sales, or the group of C people like the CEO and COO and all those. Okay, so you take the lowest level that is still involved in that. That's your level 1. Then you take your level 2 as the people that report to this level 1. By definition, they are not involved in crafting the business strategy. And then level 3 reports to level 2. So of these 3 levels, you want to have more than half of your people have to come from middle, from level 2. People that did not have to do with crafting the business strategy. Why? Because the literature suggests that people that were personally involved in crafting the business strategy have a dog in the fight. And they tend to see the business strategy under different eyes, a more rosy view than people that were not involved in crafting it. Then, for different tasks, you want to involve different people. In the task of articulation, you want to have people that know what things really are like in the field. Because articulation is about seeing yourself in the mirror, words and all. So you want people that are straight shooters and that know operations. For the specification, you want people that are knowledgeable about the strategy and what are the overall objectives of the firm. Then for things like implementation, again, you want people that are operative. So I would say you should assemble a team that includes people with both a subset of people that are more operationally driven but understand strategy, and another subset of people that are deeply familiar with the strategy but understands operations. And then you may use this group as a whole or as 2 sub-teams in different specific tasks.
Okay, and next question, how can you ensure that these various objectives and supporting actions are effectively communicated through the supply chain organization, and particularly in companies that span multiple countries and business units?
Well, the fact is that the specific list of imperatives would not need to be spread throughout different continents and countries, because the imperatives apply to a specific business unit. Now, if you have a business unit that operates across many continents, then yes, you will have to communicate those imperatives to those within that business unit, but not, it is not, we have to differentiate between, for example, the corporate guidelines that do apply to everybody and are the subject of much propaganda and you know, like pitching to their own internal people. But we have to differentiate between that and the imperatives which apply just to your business unit. Now, I will not speak as to how you should preach the imperatives within the organization, because that's not within my realm of expertise. But I think the literature exists about how to communicate things internally. My recommendation would be limited to the following. Make sure your imperatives are explicit, because if your imperatives are not explicit and you leave people guessing what they are supposed to be doing, then we have no guarantee that they are all shooting for the same goal. Now, as to the mechanics of how you spread them across your workforce, I would defer to the experts on organizational behavior.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any examples where this thought process has been applied rigorously to deliver an unexpected positive outcome?
We have a couple of examples. We have conducted these collaborative management research projects with 3 Fortune 100 companies, with the United States government, the Federal Highway Authority in particular, and one of the divisions of the United Nations. And other projects have been conducted with smaller firms. And I have to say, in terms of unexpected results, there's always an aha moment in the project. For example, let me mention a couple. In one early project, the aha moment was that the fact that this firm was articulating the pillars in terms of what are called superlatives, was creating a problem. They said, we want the minimal working inventory, we want the maximal customer service, and we want to minimize this, maximize that. And so using this kind of extreme terminology was creating confusion, because people didn't know what was priority number one. Is my priority number one to reduce cost, or to increase customer satisfaction? So what comes first, to what extent, and up to what point? It was not clear because of the wording of the language. And after the articulation exercise and the evaluation, we came up with this very clear sign of conflict that I christened the triangle of death, that I'm showing now in the slides. Let me see if I can. Here, the triangle of death, where we saw reciprocally detrimental relationships between things like minimizing the delivered cost and operating with the lowest working capital and delivering the best-in-class service. But you can see how these superlatives are here: best, lowest, lowest again. So that was, funny thing is that was unexpected for them. It's a textbook trade-off problem, but it was unexpected. They did not see it coming. Another example of an unexpected result was in the project after this, where the realization was that the company was trying to serve 3 very different types of customers using the exact same pipeline. And these 3 different types of customers had very different needs in terms of speed and service levels, but they were all being fed with the same pipeline. So everyone was drinking from a fire hose, even though some of them only needed a few drops of water. And I still remember the words of the VP of supply chain, because the senior VP of supply chain, because when he said it, they kind of got burned into my brain. He said, when you showed us that diagnostic, that conflict between the 3 types of customers, it's like a light bulb went off. I realized we were trying to be everything to everybody. So these are things that once you state them, they seem obvious. But the funny thing is that, and the powerful thing about this method is that, even though it is not obvious to the people involved at the beginning, our structure will make these things, bring them to float, so that they become apparent. So I will wrap it up saying there's always a lesson, and there's at least one aha moment per project.
We have another question. Since the groups that develop the strategy and implement the strategy are often different, what are the best practices to measure the success of the strategy?
That is a good question. First, I have to say that I steer clear of the word best practice. We think that each situation is unique, and it's very hard to speak in terms of best practices. But the question is valid. So you have one group of people telling you what the strategy is, and you have another group of people implementing it. Precisely what we're advocating is that that should not happen. Fine, there's one group of people that will develop the corporate strategy. But the people that develop the business strategy, what I call the level 1 people, they have to be involved in this exercise too, at least at the lowest level. The lowest level of people that were involved, still involved in crafting the business strategy, they have to be involved here because they know the spirit of what was meant by the business strategy, and they need to realize the difficulties in executing and implementing this thing. And they can illuminate those that are trying to implement it. Now, conversely, something else we recommend is that the supply chain guys should have a seat at the strategy table. The supply chain should not be an afterthought to the business strategy formulation process. So before you sign with blood a new business strategy, make sure to run it through your supply chain guys. And also, when your supply chain guys are trying to figure out how they're going to implement it, make sure that you are at their table trying to figure it out.
Thank you. Another question here, how would you create a business case, i.e. costs, benefits, for complexity, a complexity-based supply chain strategy?
This is not the views of CTL, this is my personal view. I think that it is very hard, if not impossible, to make cost-benefit case for a strategic decision, for the simple reason that strategic decisions are usually too, they are usually they are supposed to have an impact that is long in time, that spreads over many years, and they usually address things in complex environments, and you cannot isolate the benefit of that measure and say it saved me $3 million, because you don't know. You can guess that it's going to save you between 5 and 10 millions, but that's a guesstimate at best. That doesn't mean that people don't do it. People will do a business case and say, we're going to save $2.5 million by doing this and that and this is how it's going to work. And then if you were to do a postmortem, you would see that, number one, you would not be able to differentiate which saving came from where, unless you were allocating it, but that's just in your mind. And second, there's this bunch of confounding variables that also happened. There was an economic crisis in between. There was you picked up a new customer or dropped a supplier in the middle. So how do you know what came from where? So I think the strategic decisions should be made with a strategic mindset, not with a numerical mindset. For example, a company may decide to drop a supplier because that supplier doesn't follow environmentally sound practices or fair labor practices. So how do you make a business case for that? Well, it's not about cost and benefit. It's about making business with people whose name you want associated to you, right? So I think asking the question of how do I put dollar signs next to this is not the right question. Now, that is not the right question doesn't mean that it's not the frequently asked question. That's the question that all the time comes up. But I think it's still, nonetheless, the wrong question.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. So I think with that, we did see there are a few more questions came up. We'll try to answer those directly to you. But I just wanted to let you know about a few things that CTL has coming up that may be of interest for those of you attending. I want to thank you for your participation. We had over 100 participants online today, so that was great. And thank you again, Roberto, for a very informative discussion. We will, as we said, make the slides available to all of you within the next day or so. On December 4th, we are having a book launch and signing event. Dr. Yossi Sheffi, who is the director of our center, recently wrote a book on logistics clusters. We will be doing an event here on campus in the Media Lab on December 4th, and there is a URL there on the slide for those of you who are interested in attending or would like more information about that. We also have an executive education course, January 8th through the 11th, Supply Chain Management Driving Strategic Advantage. We encourage you to look at our website there for more information and how to register, and we hope to see some of you there. And finally, if you are interested in learning more about the supply chain exchange here at CTL, please feel free to contact Bob Vaz. His email is right there, rvaz@mit.edu, and he'll be happy to speak with you more about some of the benefits of partnering with us here at the center. Thank you again, all of you, for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in February.